We might call this a naked emperor equilibrium, an ongoing situation in which the emperor has no clothes. Everybody can see that he's naked, and yet everybody thinks, I sure don't want to be the only one saying it. As a result, we collaborate in a charade by keeping our real views to ourselves. Then somebody comes along who defies the consensus and speaks out, like the little kid in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Clothes, who doesn't realize he's not supposed to say out loud what everyone can plainly see. The thing about that kid who says, the emperor is naked, it's not simply that he says it or even that others hear him saying it. Declaring the truth out loud in the public square is a truly subversive act precisely because it creates a situation in which everybody knows that everybody else has heard what has been said. Okay, I've got a text. I'm going to share it with you. I'm going to make an argument. I want to stick closely to the framework that I've developed, so I'm going to share the text. And then we can talk afterwards and have a bit of a colloquy. My title, A Theory of Self-Censorship, Political Correctness, quote unquote, and Related Phenomena. Uncertainty about what motivates senders of public messages leads receivers to read between the lines in order to discern senders' deepest commitments. Anticipating this, senders write between the lines, editing their expressions so as to further their own ends. In this lecture, I will examine how this interactive process of inference and strategy affects the quality and extent of public deliberations on sensitive issues. A principal conclusion is that genuine moral discourse on difficult social issues can become impossible when the risks of upsetting some portion of one's audience are too great. Reliance on euphemism and platitude should be expected in this strategic climate. Groups may embark on a tragic course of action that was believed by many from the outset to be ill-conceived, but that has become virtually impossible to criticize. That's a prologue for the lecture tonight. I want to talk now about spirals of silence. It's a cautionary tale. There are things that don't or can't get said when we talk about race in most venues in America. Those who have followed the 16-year-long conversation on this topic that I've been undertaking with Columbia University Professor John McWhorter at my podcast, The Glenn Show, know what I'm talking about. Whether it's crime or out-of-wedlock birth rates or academic underperformance, or the unbearable intellectual lightness of much anti-racism agitation. In academia, mainstream publications and media outlets, and increasingly in K-12 classrooms, what I've called the bias narrative holds sway. Negative aspects of Black life are attributed almost entirely to the nation's history of racial oppression, which is said to begin in the early 17th century and to continue unabated to this day. We are said to be a bandit society built on genocidal plundering undertaken by unrepentant racists. That's one story you could tell. And if that story were just one of many circulating through our national discourse, it wouldn't be the worst thing. But this bias narrative has become not just one of many stories, it's now the only story in newspaper opinion pages and scholarly journals and in educational materials disseminated throughout our schools. It's the story which until recently was told by the White House. It's the story that ramifies out from the most elite precincts of our country and shapes ordinary conversation and relations between individuals. Its grip on so many areas of the public imagination has become so tight, particularly at academic institutions, not this one, that anyone challenging it is viewed with suspicion and often enough outright contempt. Should any alternative explanation for Black underperformance be proffered, it's not the explanation that gets challenged, but the individual making it. For to challenge this biased narrative ipso facto proves that one is, well, a racist or deplorable, or if the challenger is a Black man like me, a self-hating Uncle Tom. To object to the narrative is to invite ad hominem attack. Now, I believe this situation to be intellectually infantile and morally bankrupt. But even worse, I think it is also socially counterproductive and politically ineffective. We need to stay in touch with reality. How we talk and think about race has consequences that can be measured not just in dollars and cents, but also in stagnant lives and dead bodies. Responding with ad hominem attacks to any account of our current predicament that is not rooted in bias isn't merely unfortunate, it's actively damaging. The stakes are enormously high here, and the hour is late. Candor, integrity, and courage have been in short supply in our national conversations about race. And not only there, name-calling and character assassination have largely replaced open debates, while naked emperors, pseudo-academics, and bombastic demagogues command the public square. Enter John and Glenn. Our singular focus, our primary job has been to call them like we see them. And even though I may be treading on thin ice, that's precisely what I intend to do here. A professor or politician or entertainer or some other public figure is accused of racism or sexism or anti-Semitism or transphobia. And before the charges can even be investigated, poof, their career goes up in smoke, whether or not they've actually done anything genuinely worthy of censure. Often, they're guilty of little more than choosing their words carelessly, and just as often, they're guilty, at least in my view, of nothing more offensive than telling the truth. This state of affairs is untenable, and I have no problem saying so. Indeed, calling someone a racist today is a bit like calling them a witch. It's to accuse them of having evil beliefs because they've deviated from the party line. Such beliefs are not necessarily evil, however. Attending to inconvenient facts like a racial disparity in out-of-wedlock birth rates or academic achievement or violent criminal offending is not ipso facto an act of racial hatred, and I cannot be the only one who thinks so. Others feel the same way, and more of them are beginning to speak out against specious accusations. But not enough yet. Many who recognize the terrible injustice of such accusations fear repercussions from defending the accused. They don't want the mob to direct its ire at them. They have much to lose and little to gain. As we game theorists have long understood, a boycott's success depends critically on the effectiveness of its secondary sanctions, that is, the punishing of those who do not punish those who deviate. So if the anti-racism witch hunt is to work, everybody must shun the purported racists. In fact, many who do so are just pretending that something truly evil is afoot because they don't want to be shunned themselves. They're going along to get along, suppressing their skepticism. Such widespread suppression is a disaster waiting to happen. It creates conditions ripe for exploitation by canny demagogues who can harness the resentment of the stifled masses and, in the process, unleash something very ugly in this country. That is my greatest fear. That is why it's important for people like me to speak out. I once read a book by the German political scientist Elisabeth Neumann called The Spiral of Silence. Her argument was that there can be some views on some issues in society that get defined in such a way that it's inappropriate to hold those views. As a result, people who do hold those views, but who do not want to be shamed and ostracized, don't express them. And because they don't hear it said by others, anyone holding the view thinks that they may be one of only a very few who do so. And not wanting to be out there alone saying something controversial, they keep their thoughts to themselves. A spiral of silence ensues. We might call this a naked emperor equilibrium, an ongoing situation in which the emperor has no clothes. Everybody can see that he's naked, and yet everybody thinks, I sure don't want to be the only one saying it. As a result, we collaborate in a charade by keeping our real views to ourselves. Then somebody comes along who defies the consensus and speaks out, like the little kid in Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Clothes, who doesn't realize he's not supposed to say out loud what everyone can plainly see. The thing about that kid who says, the emperor is naked, is not simply that he says it or even that others hear him saying it. Declaring the truth out loud in the public square is a truly subversive act precisely because it creates a situation in which everybody knows that everybody else has heard what has been said. What began as widespread but forbidden private knowledge of an unspeakable fact is suddenly transformed into a shared public consensus, making it safe for anyone else to assert that fact. This spiral of silence, this spiral of silence may be an unstable equilibrium, susceptible to being undermined by a cumulative snowballing process of revelation. The real-life agent of change, like the kid in that story, could turn out to be a Trump-like figure, only more effective, smarter and shrewder, somebody who can see that a Black Lives Matter activist standing up with a bald fist shouting, "Burn this city down," upsets a lot of people. Someone who believes that to abandon meritocratic standards in the interest of achieving racial diversity is to step onto a slippery slope that slides all the way down to mediocrity. A clever and ambitious politician, a shrewd manager of public images, could create a circumstance where more and more people feel safe expressing such views. And the more who express them, the safer those who have yet to speak out will feel in expressing them too. If a widespread view has been kept under wraps by the social boycott threats of the anti-racist, then an explosion can occur. You could find yourself in a very different country tomorrow than you see today, as the spiral of silence unravels, as a daring naysayer takes on the slings and arrows of being called a witch, while tapping into widely held, if heretofore unexpressed, sentiments. My fear is that regarding the most controversial racial issues of our day, violent crime, racial preferences, slavery reparations, compulsory diversity training, this is the situation we now confront. It's a situation that could be unraveling even as I speak, before our very eyes, and ultimately in a very ugly way. I want now to revisit that 1994 essay of mine that was mentioned in the introduction. Self-Censorship and Public Discourse, A Theory of Political Correctness, published in the sociology journal Rationality and Society, and to be reprinted in my forthcoming book, Self-Censorship. In that essay, I wrote as follows: political correctness is an important theme in the raging culture war, starting over issues such as abortion, affirmative action, multicultural studies, environmentalism, feminism, and gay rights. The political correctness debate has spread into newsrooms, movie studios, and even the halls of Congress. Critics, mainly on the right, claim that only the correct views on these and other sensitive issues can be expressed on campus, in print, on film, or in electoral politics, without eliciting extreme, stifling reactions from activists who seek to make their opinions into an enforced orthodoxy. They cite a litany of woes about how in venues where the left is most powerful, those who express even mildly divergent views are treated poorly. In response, liberals describe these charges as overblown and insist that their efforts to hold people accountable for what they say and write are justified in the name of legitimate moral concerns. Now, despite all that has transpired in the intervening decades, from the advent of social media to the rise of Donald Trump, I believe that description of disagreement about our politics, discourses on sensitive cultural and political issues between the left and the right remains apt. Indeed, we can usefully distinguish two levels at which this disagreement occurs. At the primary level, partisan arguments on certain questions divide public opinion. How bad is the date rape problem and what should be done about it? What texts are canonical in our non-Western cultures adequately represented among them? What causes the violence that erupts among young men of color in cities, and how can it be reduced? And so on. Disagreements on these substantive matters stem from the different values, factual judgments, and theoretical frameworks that people employ to analyze the world around them. Such disagreements are inevitable, and I'd say on the whole healthy. They have the potential to engender constructive exchanges from which all participants can learn and better public policies can emerge. However, at a secondary level, a contentious discussion is taking place over the very nature of these primary level discussions. That's where self-censorship comes in. Are speakers treated respectfully regardless of the popularity of their views? Are some opinions given privileged access in the media? Are people candid in their arguments? Who can talk about what topics and when without violating some unspoken canon of decency? Do advocates of one position seek to prevent or to discredit the expression of opposing ideas? Do some arguments so offend the sensibilities of some citizens that they should be preemptively excluded from public debate? These two levels of discussion can become confused. Some complaints about political correctness really are, upon examination, merely laments that within a certain community of discourse, the complainer's views are unpopular. However, the most serious questions raised in the political correctness debate focus on this secondary level. The fundamental issue is whether the climate for voicing of opinion in important forums, and the universities are by no means the only forums of interest, continues to permit a constructive, informative dialogue on vital matters of common concern. Increasingly, it seems to me there is reason to doubt that this is so. And for that reason, I undertook 30 years ago in my 1994 essay to provide an analysis of political correctness, and I'd like to review that argument. Unlike many who had written and still are writing on this topic, I did not waste time telling horror stories about the excesses of political zealots or lamenting their influence on the campuses and elsewhere, nor will I do so here. Instead, I endeavored to lay bare the underlying logic at work, to expose the social forces that create and sustain movements of this sort. Two preliminary observations set the stage for my analysis. They continue to be relevant today. First, although political correctness is often spoken of as a threat to free speech, and this is indeed the case when it results in legal restrictions on open expression, as those imposed by formal speech codes, the more subtle threat is the voluntary limitations on expression a climate of social conformity encourages. That is, it's not the iron fist of repression, but the velvet glove of seduction that is the real problem. Accordingly, I treated the political correctness phenomenon as an implicit social convention of restraint on public expression that operates within a given community. Conventions of this kind can arise because A, a community needs to assess whether the beliefs of its members are consistent with its collective and formally avowed purposes, and B, scrutiny of their members' public statements is often an efficient way to determine whether or not their beliefs cohere with communal norms. This need to police group members' beliefs so as to ferret out deviance, along with the fact that the expression of heretical opinion may be the best available evidence of deviance, creates the possibility for what I call self-censorship. That is, members whose beliefs are sound, but who nevertheless depart from the communal wisdom in some respect, are compelled through fear of ostracism to dissemble, avoiding the candid expression of their opinions. Second, despite the attention that has been given to recent developments on campus, the phenomenon of political correctness, understood as an implicit convention about the restrained nature of public speech, is neither new nor unusual. Indeed, pressuring speakers and writers to affirm acceptable beliefs and to suppress unacceptable views is one of the constants of political experience. All social groups have norms concerning the values and beliefs that are appropriate for their members to hold on the most sensitive issues. Those seen not to share the consensus view may suffer low social esteem and face a variety of sanctions from colleagues. Apostates and heretics are not welcome within the councils of the faithful. In the United States, communists and their sympathizers paid a heavy price for their, quote, incorrect views during the early Cold War. As I've mentioned, Uncle Toms, that is blacks seen as being too eager to win favor with their white overlords, are seen and still treated like pariah by other blacks who greatly value racial solidarity. Jews critical of Israel or Muslims critical of Islam may find that they cannot go home again. Therefore, a theory of contemporary problems around political correctness should be broad enough to address these related phenomena. I have sketched an approach that I believe meets this requirement. As hinted at in the prologue for this lecture, my theory is based on a conception of political communication that stresses strategic considerations. From this point of view, people engaged in primary level debates over policy questions must also, at the secondary level, if you will, consider how their interests are affected by the specific manner in which they express themselves. From this strategic perspective, a regime of political correctness may be viewed as a stable and self-reproducing pattern of expression and inference within a given community where receivers impute undesirable qualities to senders who express themselves in an incorrect way. And as a result, most senders avoid such expressions. To illustrate, if known enemies of progressive ideals regularly make a certain argument, then someone who wants to be seen as standing on the right side of history cannot make a similar argument without the risk of being labeled a reactionary. What forces, we should ask, could create and sustain such patterns of inference? Note that what might be called, in short, an ad hominem impulse, that is, an impulse to infer ad hominem, or to conclude against the person rather than against the argument, determines the audience's response. The audience's question is, what type of person would say such a thing? Not, does that argument have merit? Ad hominem reasoning lies at the core of the political correctness phenomenon. A speaker's violation of protocol turns the public's attention away from the worth of the case and toward an inquiry into that speaker's character. And the outcome of the inquiry depends on what is known about the character of others who have spoken in a similar way. When sophisticated speakers are aware of this process of inference, many of them will be reluctant to express themselves in a way that is likely to raise suspicion that their ultimate commitments may not conform with the norms of their community. Ad hominem inference, denigrated by the high-minded, is nevertheless a vitally important defensive tactic in the forum. When discussing matters of collective relevance, knowing where the speaker stands helps us to gauge the weight we should give an argument, an opinion, or a factual assertion offered in the debate. If we know that a speaker shares our basic values, we are more readily willing to accept from that person observations that run contrary to our initial sense of things. We are less eager to dismiss his rebuttal of our arguments and more willing to believe facts reported by him that carry unpleasant implications. Conversely, speakers with values very different from ours are probably pursuing ends at odds with those we would choose if we had the same information. The possibility of adverse manipulation makes such people dangerous when allowed to remain among us undetected. Thus, whenever political discourse takes place under conditions of uncertainty about the values of participants, a certain vetting process occurs in which we cautiously try to learn more about the larger commitments of those who advocate a particular course of action. If, by the various means available, an individual is discovered not to share in the deepest value commitments of a particular community, the reaction may well be to exclude that person from participation in future deliberations and to disparage him publicly for his deviance. The social ostracism, verbal abuse, and extreme disapproval, damage to reputation, and loss of professional opportunity that can occur when one is judged to deviate from some strongly held moral consensus. These are very unpleasant experiences. So, when there is broad agreement on what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable opinion, prudent persons will conduct themselves so as to avoid giving gratuitous offense to received orthodoxy. Those who speak in flagrant violation of the conventional wisdom must know the risk they are taking and must therefore be acting in full recognition of the possible consequences. Being sanctioned for the expression of disapproved opinion seldom befalls someone by accident. It is more often the result of freely choosing to say the disapproved thing. Now, it is probable that real deviants within a given community, that is, those who are in fact incorrect in their actual political sensibilities and who do not share the moral consensus of the community on the issues in question, find the prospect of ostracism less distressing than those who, in their heart of hearts, agree with the community view in broad outline, even though perhaps not with its every detail. Crucial to my argument, then, is the following syllogism. Suppose that A, within a given community, the people who are most faithful to communal values are by and large also those who most want to remain in good standing with their fellows. And B, the practice is well established in that community that those who speak in ways that are known to offend communal values do not remain in good standing. Then we could conclude, C, when a speaker is observed to express himself or herself offensively, a listener's odds are increased that the speaker in question is not really faithful to the communal values, as estimated by someone otherwise uninformed about the person's actual views. That numeral C follows from A and B is a simple consequence of rational inference by listeners given rational behavior by senders. But this reasoning implies that sanctions against some form of expression could become a self-sustaining convention, assuming a positive association between fidelity and sociability. There may exist an equilibrium in the communal expression game in which apostates are identified by their differential willingness to utter phrases known to be associated with a disapproved belief. For if it is commonly known that morally suspicious speech invites sanction, and if sanction causes greater harm to those who really share our values than those who do not, then the very fact that someone chooses to act in a way that is to utter the disapproved phrase suggests statistically that the speaker more probably does not share in the consensus. Suspicious speech signals deviance because once the practice of punishing those who express certain ideas has become well established, the only ones who risk ostracism by speaking recklessly are those who place so little value on partaking in our community that they must be presumed not to partake in our dearest common values. It is in this sense that I can say there is no entirely free speech. For anyone speaking out on a controversial matter pays the particular price of having others know that he was willing to speak under a given set of circumstances in a certain way. When listeners know that not everyone would be willing to pay that price, and specifically that true believers are less likely than apostates to risk incurring the community's wrath, they can make empirically valid inferences about the unobservable values of the reckless speaker. In this way, norm-offending speech conveys more than just literal meanings. Anticipating these inferences and wanting not to be seen as deviant, prudent true believers may elect to say nothing that risks offending collective sensibility. By doing so, they leave the field clear for apostates, thereby creating the meaning in effect that norm-offending speech identifies deviant belief. In circumstances of this kind, a climate of self-censorship can become entrenched. Such self-censorship is the hidden face of political correctness. For every act of aberrant speech seen to be punished by the thought police, there are countless other critical arguments, dissents from received truth, unpleasant factual reports, or nonconformist deviations of thought that go unexpressed or whose expression is distorted because potential speakers rightly fear the consequences of a candid exposition of their views. As a result of this process that I have identified, the public discussion of vital issues can become dangerously impoverished. That was theory. I want to shift gears now and talk about succumbing to self-censorship from a personal perspective. Bear with me. Early in 2024, I was invited to speak about Black-Jewish relations at a synagogue in Palm Beach, Florida. It was a subject I had spoken and written about before. Still, as the date approached, I grew more and more nervous. What was expected of me? Had I asked the event's organizers, I'm sure they would have said that nothing was expected except that I come and give my views on whatever aspects of the topic interested me, answer some questions from the audience, and attend the lovely meals and receptions that they had planned. But the war was on my mind. The reports of the dead, the grotesque images, and the terrifying accounts of refugees weighed heavily on me. In the months since Hamas's vicious attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, the death toll in Gaza had been mounting at a dizzying pace. The United States had, in short order, affirmed its support for Israel and was supplying a steady flow of weapons and money, paying only lip service to what I was beginning to view, what I could not help but view as a humanitarian disaster, not because of the dead Hamas militants and their political leadership who all knew what they'd been signing up for, but because of the dead women and children and elderly people, because of the dead medics and journalists. The news of dire food shortages in Gaza chilled me, as did images of block after block of bombed-out ruins that once housed apartments, schools, and businesses. Now, Israel had a right to respond to Hamas attacks. Indeed, considering the brutality of the October 7th assault, Israel had a duty and a responsibility to respond. Nevertheless, the killing of thousands upon thousands of non-combatants, while hundreds of thousands were subjected to injury and starvation, and the homes of millions were destroyed, seemed to me an unacceptably high cost to pay for the goal of eliminating or eradicating Hamas, especially since it was unclear whether and how that goal would ever be accomplished. What was being done in Gaza, if arguably necessary from Israel's point of view, nevertheless amounted to a set of horrific deeds with which I was loath to see my own country associated. These thoughts troubled me. They made me question my long-standing affirmation of Israel's prerogative to do whatever it deemed necessary to defend itself and my country's support for the same. When I hinted publicly at my growing doubts about Israel's actions in Gaza, I received immediate blowback. Friends and strangers alike were emailing me long missives, taking me to task for my historical ignorance, listing figures about acceptable civilian-to-combatant death ratios and reiterating Israel's embattled regional position. The common refrain that emerged from ardent pro-Israel politicians, media figures, spokesmen, and others was this: to suggest that Israel was killing too many civilians in Gaza amounted to a betrayal of the Jewish people. Now I chafed at this idea. I knew that I am not an anti-Semite. But it soon became clear that giving voice to my misgivings about my country's involvement with Israel's conduct of this war risked having me labeled as one. And so the date of the speech loomed. Now, I would never conflate the Jewish people and the state of Israel, but from what I knew of that synagogue and the organizers, I would be speaking to people who more likely than not would object to any criticism of Israel's conduct in the war. I felt that to march into that synagogue, a synagogue that had gone out of its way to welcome me, and then, without warning, to say things I knew would be grievously offensive to the sensibilities of those assembled, would have been extraordinarily rude. And yet, this was an urgent matter for Gazans and Israelis, yes, but also in a different way for us Americans. The U.S. logistical and diplomatic support of the war was a point of heated conflict on college campuses, such as Brown, where I teach. The pro-Palestinian side did have its excesses, and some true anti-Semites were taking advantage of it, but that did not negate, for me, the moral and prudential core of arguments for a ceasefire, coupled, of course, with the release of Israeli hostages. I chose not to raise the subject of the war at all at that synagogue. But I didn't avoid the topic out of mere politeness. Up to that point on my podcast, The Glenn Show, I had merely dropped hints that I was uncomfortable with America's role. But I was afraid of what taking an explicit, full-throated position critical of Israel's military response would do to my reputation. I was wary that the issue was so charged that I could lose friends over it. And I knew that some readers and viewers of my comments would infer the worst, that I was taking sides against the Jewish state and hence against the Jewish people. These perceived pressures, and some of them were more than merely perceived, have led me to approach the topic tentatively and sometimes even to hold my tongue, whereas I normally have no problem speaking my mind, even when I know that my views on racial politics, for example, are unpopular. And so I found myself in this position of self-censorship at that synagogue. I opted to avoid the topic entirely rather than risk coming out as a true critic of the war. Paradoxically, I was very much aware of the social and psychological processes at work within me as I elected not to speak about what I believed to be the most pressing of subjects. It is indeed a tribute to the power of self-censorship that it can take hold even when one knows how it works and why it ought to be resisted. In my old 1994 essay, I explained how a process of directing one's inferences against the person, what I called an ad hominem inference, blocks the open exchange of views on divisive issues. I've spoken about that here tonight. It is a process whereby listeners judge speakers not only on the basis of what is said, but also on the basis of what reasonably may be concluded about their unstated values and ulterior motives. Knowing this, speakers choose their words carefully. Silence is often the best option. If this was true of the political correctness debate when I first published that essay more than 3 decades ago, it is true in spades of the debate about Israel and Palestine today. Whatever I may say about Gaza, whether I say that I believe the Israel Defense Force's actions to be heinous crimes, fully justifiable defensive measures, or something in between, this will spur my audience to infer information not explicitly stated about my ostensibly concealed personal beliefs and about my character. The key question for many will become just what kind of person says something like that. Thus, if I say Israel must go to whatever lengths it deems necessary to defend itself, some will infer that I hate Palestinians or care little for their safety. And by contrast, if I say Israel must bear some moral responsibility for the high number of dead non-combatants, some will infer that I hate the Jewish people or care little for its safety. Now, I can protest that the inference is untrue, but in either case, such denials would do little to exonerate me in the eyes of those who take such statements to be nothing but the acceptable public face of nefarious private beliefs. This is particularly so if others, known to have nefarious beliefs, are making similar statements. This private belief signaling game could go on forever. The list of adverse inferences about someone who publicly addresses a controversial subject in an unpopular manner, that list is as long as the list of possible audiences. Again, there's no such thing as context-free expression. Standing before a congregation at a synagogue is one context. Dining at the home of a close friend whom I know to hold staunchly pro-Zionist views is another. Writing the afterword to a book addressed to a general audience on self-censorship is yet another context. Moreover, given the realities of digital communication, we must allow that something said in one context will be available in all the others. Tailoring one's message so that it will be understood by every possible audience in the way the speaker intends would be so complex as to be practically impossible, and as a result, mistaken ad hominem inferences are virtually guaranteed. Now, I reiterate this little bit of the theory I developed, not to distract from the issue at hand, but to explain what I think the issue really is. For in some sense, my views about Gaza, like those of most individuals, are of little consequence. I'm not a politician or a Middle East expert or a military strategist or a professor of international relations. I'm commenting as a reasonably well-informed social critic rather than as a specialist. No one with any power to affect the situation on the ground in Gaza would ever hire me as an advisor, nor should they. Even so, what I have said publicly about the war has been closely attended to. Now, this is understandable. The stakes are enormously high for those directly enmeshed in the conflict. They seek allies wherever they can find them. As a result, the ad hominem inferential heat has been turned up for those of us lucky enough to be able to comment from the sidelines rather than to experience the front lines. Anyone talking about Gaza, whatever the nuances of their argument, is going to be sorted into the friend pile or the enemy pile and treated accordingly. There is no third pile. This, then, is my point. I'm not an enemy of Israel, but I have had problems with what its military has been doing in Gaza and with its influence on American policy. I'm certainly not an enemy of the Jewish people. I could run down my bona fides on that account, but what would I say? Some of my best friends are Jewish, which is true enough. I loathe the anti-Semites who use protest against Israel to gin up hatred for Jews, but I admire those sincere protesters and activists who want to put a stop to the unnecessary bloodshed and an end to the humanitarian crisis. Having just heard the preceding paragraph, some of you, if you were not already decided, have sorted me into one pile or the other. This leaves me to perform a calculation of my own. Namely, at what point does the cost of speaking my mind outweigh the benefit? At that Palm Beach synagogue, I performed that calculation subconsciously and determined that the personal cost of speaking my mind outweighed the benefit. I kept my mouth shut about Gaza, and I have felt shame about that silence ever since. Now, it can be argued that we should all be willing to risk the consequences of free expression if we truly believe in the causes and ideas that move us. But how many can afford to lose their livelihoods over a principle? As for me, I'm well into my 8th decade of life now, at the end of an illustrious academic career, if I may say so. I could, if I so chose, never work another day and still live out the rest of my life in comfort. Perhaps then the personal stakes are not as high as I have made them out to be. But this is not about me. It's about us. And the stakes in times of war are surely high enough. We can calculate the cost of speaking out, but how can we possibly calculate the cost of not speaking out? We can enumerate the catastrophes that have resulted when ordinary people in a position to stop a great wrong instead did nothing, believing that they could not bear the cost of speaking out because they could not be sure they had the support of their fellows. It could be argued that those who remained silent did not know the price of that silence until it was already too late. One wonders what tragedies could have been averted, how much suffering avoided had everyone known the other's mind. Spirals of silence can be very costly indeed. There is a reason why certain opinions are often met with censorious opposition. That is an efficient way to control the discourse. You can't silence everyone, but then you don't have to. Destroy the reputations of a few prominent people, and everyone who agrees with them will fall into line. Level the ad hominem attack. He thinks that because he's an anti-Semite. And the substantive issues get drowned out while an unpopular speaker struggles to defend not his ideas or thoughts, but his very person. A pall of suspicion falls over him. He is sorted into one pile or the other. Once that sorting has taken place, no amount of self-exculpatory pleading can undo it. When a person's character is assassinated, it tends to stay dead, and not even the corrective of historical hindsight can revive it. Silence, as a defensive measure, has its appeal. But those of us who defend free speech have a special responsibility to speak our minds openly when we know that the others who share our views will not or cannot do the same. We're inevitably placed in a vulnerable position for even audiences that would in principle affirm the necessity of speaking out, sometimes attempt to squelch the speech that they don't like. I can tell you it hurts to lose an ally, a friend, or an audience because they no longer consider you on their side. But that personal pain is part of the cost we must be willing to pay if the alternative is to remain silent, even as we know that it is our responsibility to speak up. So, whatever its social origins, the fundamental activity of self-censorship takes place within each of us as individuals. It may well turn out that I could not afford the social costs of speaking my mind on Gaza. But one thing is certain. If I want to maintain my own self-respect, I cannot afford not to pay that cost. In conclusion, I want to speak about the limits of utilitarianism and the virtues of living within the truth. One of the finest statements ever written on these questions, I believe, is Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. Confronting the overarching repression of the post-totalitarian system in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, Havel describes the existential and ideological features of late communism that gave the dissidents their power. Quote, between the aims of the post-totalitarian system and the aims of life, there is a yawning abyss, he writes. While life moves toward the fulfillment of its own freedom, the system demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. The system is permeated by lies, he says. Workers are enslaved in the name of the working class. The expansion of empire is depicted as support for the oppressed. Denial of free expression is supposed to be the highest form of freedom. Rigged elections are the highest form of democracy, and so on. For the system to continue, individual citizens must make their peace with these lies. They must choose to, quote, live within a lie. The dissident, says Havel, who quixotically refuses to go along with the program, defiantly attempting to, quote, live within the truth, that person is profoundly subversive. Quoting Havel, by breaking the rules of the game, he has disrupted the game as such. He has exposed it as a mere game. He has said that the emperor is naked, and because the emperor is, in fact, naked, something extremely dangerous has happened, close quote. And thus, the struggle between the aims of the system, as Havel put it, and the aims of life takes place not between social classes or political parties or aggregates of people aligned on opposite sides for and against the system. Rather, says Havel, this struggle is fought within each human being. And here's the passage that I just love. The essential aims of life are present naturally in every person. In everyone, there is some longing for humanity's rightful dignity, for moral integrity, for free expression of being, and a sense of transcendence over the world of existences. Yet, I continue quoting Havel, at the same time, each person is capable to a greater or lesser degree of coming to terms with living within the lie. Each person somehow succumbs to a profane trivialization of his or her inherent humanity and to utilitarianism. In everyone, says Havel, there is some willingness to merge with the anonymous crowd and to flow comfortably along with it down the river of pseudo-life. This, he concludes, is much more than a simple conflict between two identities. It is something far worse. It is a challenge to the very notion of identity itself. Truth, Havel concludes, has its own special power in the post-totalitarian system. Quoting him again, under the orderly surface of the life of lies, there slumbers the hidden sphere of life in its real aims, of its hidden openness to truth, close quote. Now, I certainly do not intend to compare the constrained, expressive environment of contemporary American politics with the systematic extirpation of dissent characteristic of the totalitarian state. But I nevertheless find the moral dimensions of Havel's argument relevant to the dilemmas faced by individuals in our own society. Conventions of self-censorship are sustained by the utilitarian acquiescence of each community member in an order that at some level denies the whole truth. By calculating that the losses derived from deviation outweigh the gains, individuals are led to conform. And yet, by doing so, we yield something of our individuality and our dignity. We surrender something of our humanity to the system. Usually, this is a minor matter, more like the small sacrifices we make for the sake of social etiquette rather than some grand political compromise. But as I hope to have made clear in the foregoing, circumstances will arise when far weightier concerns are at stake. The same calculus is at work in every case. How then are the demagogues and the haters to be denounced? How can reason gain a voice in the forum? How can the truth about our nation, our party, our race, our church come to light when the social forces of conformity and the rhetorical conventions of banality hold sway? How can we have a genuine moral discourse about ambiguous and difficult matters when the security and comfort of the platitudes lie so readily at hand? Although it may violate the communal norms of my economics fraternity to say so, I believe that these things can be achieved only when individuals, first a few and then many, transcend the world of existences by acting not as utilitarian calculators, but rather as fully human, fully moral agents, determined at whatever cost to live within the truth. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is, I've noticed, maybe because I've thought about these kinds of things before as well, sometimes I have like a heuristic for deciding whether or not I like someone based on whether or not they say something that is not in their own self-interest. So the kinds of things you're talking about. And maybe that's an entirely rational argument, but that my mind's come to, but maybe it has something to do with the psychology you were describing in your talk as well. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm thinking about something I read in Kant. I think it's in the Grundrisse, about how do I know if a man is acting morally? Well, it's when it costs him something to take the action that I can infer that it's not a self-interested act, but it's an act on behalf of a higher ideal. But I don't know. More? You got more to the question?
Well, I guess the question is, like, how does this this thing that Kant and I have both mentioned relate to the psychological theory you were talking about earlier? Like your theory, from what I understand, was that like our psychology works in such a way that we are kind of inclined towards silence. But there's also this mechanism that seems to kind of favor us towards people that stand out.
Okay, well, let me review my theory very briefly. A person is being silent because they don't want to be thought ill of. And the people who happen to be speaking out are the ones about whom it is fairly reliably known that they are deviants, that they are heretics. So the heretics have the floor. So the psychology is just the calculation. I don't want to be thought ill of. I do, in fact, agree with the heretics on this particular point, but I think I'll just keep my powder dry so as not to be thought ill of. And that can be a self-confirming circumstance, because given that only the heretics are speaking out, any listener who hears someone speaking in a similar way is correct to infer that the person speaking is a heretic, and hence the ones who are not real heretics don't speak. I repeat myself, and I'm kind of filibustering because I don't know what to say to your question.
And that's okay. I think I didn't express any of my question very well, so it's fair. But when you expressed it, you did express it well, that it's inherent in your argument is the belief that people will be thought ill of if they speak against the norm. And what I was suggesting is that, or like what I've noticed and what you mentioned that Kant noticed, is these people that speak against the norm, therefore are doing something against their self-interest, and therefore people like me think favorably of them. And so I'm wondering how that is possible. It seems like a contradiction.
Oh, this is the gadfly. Is it not? This is the contrarian. This is the person we admire. I think of Professor Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania, for example, precisely because they fly in the face of convention and they're willing to say the unspeakable. And I think that's a tendency that we ought to interrogate, the admiration.
So you think they don't deserve admiration, perhaps?
I think it's going to vary with the cases. And I think we might want to ask ourselves exactly what is thrilling us when we see the defiant gadfly stirring things up. You know, are we really, is it an epistemic position that we're taking? We're going to learn from this? Or is it a kind of identitarianism? We relish in the alienation that the gadfly cultivates by speaking against the convention. Anyway, I just finished a memoir. I've been doing a lot of asking myself questions of that kind. You know, why was I really so affected by this or that particular argument, including Amy's arguments? So, you know, that's enough confession for me for tonight.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. My question is about the first half of your talk. People like in the 1916 Project write essays about how America is stemmed from racism, and there's virtually no way that we can purge this kind of systematic oppression out of our society and culture nowadays. But they typically don't propose a solution to the issues that they write about. And so I'm wondering, with these people with the 1619 Project, Ta-Nehisi Coates, what is their big overarching goal in raising these concerns? Is it pushing the narrative of white guilt further? Is it a political gain? Is it a culture war gain? Or is it something else?
Well, okay. 1619 Project, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, he's not all bad. And you're asking the wrong guy in a way if you're asking me what's their larger vision. I mean, I have a critique of what I take to be the vision. I think the idea is about control of the historical narrative, telling the story of the country in a way that supports a more progressive and social welfare generous response to the plight of the poor and of the Black poor, of the incarcerated, of the people without health insurance, of the poorly educated, of the ill-housed. They want to move the needle in a given direction on policy. And they think that control of the narrative is the way of doing it. And, you know, I have well-rehearsed speeches against this project. One of them is that it has to do with the fact that the historical narrative is complicated. I mean, history of the United States is complicated, subtly nuanced, and it's not one thing. It's not black and white. So you have slavery, you have emancipation. I think emancipation of the slaves here in the United States and the ultimate incorporation of their descendants fully into the body politic is an amazing historical experience, warts and all. You know, so the tendentious seizing of the historical narrative on behalf of partisan political claim is something that I'm objecting to. I also think it's politically problematic. I mean, African Americans are 11, 12% of the population in a country that's dynamic, that's demographically under a lot of trends of change. And you need 50% plus one to get your way politically in a democracy. And you need a framing of the story that is something that's inviting to everybody. That's why I don't, Coates became famous writing an essay about reparations in the Atlantic Monthly. And I think that that's an ill-conceived program, even though the essay is impressive. So I'm not sure I'm answering you or not. You're asking me to speculate about the motives and the long-term objectives of people with whom I strenuously disagree. Let me just mention one other point of disagreement. I'm not all that happy about putting my fate in the hands of, if you will, white people as a Black person to do the right thing, quote unquote. If they were such racists, why should I suppose that they're going to be magnanimous in their response to my my petition? I'm more for God bless the child that's got his own, and for getting busy and whatnot. Now, people are struggling against obstacles, but they're not only Black people who struggle against obstacles. And a politics of let's help people who are putting their nose to the grindstone and need help getting ahead is kind of politics that I could get behind. And it's a politics that would do a lot to solve the racial inequality problems as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time and for coming to our not so humble university. And much like Mr. Crocker, I would also love to see you here again more often. My question is, you never really, you implied, but I guess you never directly said whether or not you regretted not speaking out at the synagogue in Florida about the war, and on your podcast not being more direct about your opinions.
You're asking me if I regret, or yeah, I kind of regretted it. I mean, it was like biting the bullet. It was like taking your medicine. I think I had a responsibility to make my audience aware of the fact that I was deeply disquieted and to engage them in a colloquy about that. And, they were going to ask me, where do I stand? What do I expect Israel to do? What about the nature of the opposition there, of Hamas and of the Islamic terrorism, and and it was going to get ugly and it was going to get rough, and I was going to have to venture into territory where I am not an expert. I'm going to concede I'm not an expert, and I elected to avoid that whole line of inquiry. Now at the podcast, I have not sort of soapbox taken a position directly to the camera and pontificated, but I've had people on to give voice to some of the concerns that I share. And I've gotten a lot of blowback because of that. And, it goes with the territory. I think I'm trying my best to live up to the ideal set forward at the end of my lecture here tonight, to live within the truth. Now, as my grandmother used to say, my mouth ain't no prayer book. When I say live within the truth, I say be true to my convictions and to my beliefs, not to objectively identify what is true about a given situation, because there are arguments all around about what is and is not true about a given situation. But being true to myself and being true to my convictions, I think, is the bare minimum, and I'm trying to do that. That's why I elected to give the talk. Believe me, there were other talks I could have given tonight that would have been less fraught.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Do you think?
Oh, that's Merrick.
Yeah, that's me. Dr. Lowry, do you think that groups who already see themselves as speaking freely and resisting the conformity, the being politically incorrect, that or radical in any direction, see them are equally likely, more likely, or less likely to repel the people who speak their minds freely in opposition to them? Maybe you could imagine the counterfactual in which you did give that speech at the synagogue. Do you think that reaction would have been worse than the reaction to some of the reactions you've gotten throughout your career from the other side?
I think I went in there with a lot of goodwill. The people who invited me admired me. They admired the public ministry that I'd been carrying out, as I mentioned, with John McWhorter, but with others at the forum that I have. I have, tens of thousands of people tuning in to what I have to say every week. And I think I would have entered in with a good deal of benefit of the doubt. I think they might have been disappointed. I think they might have been chagrined. And I'm quite sure that they would have pushed back, but I think they would have taken me as a honest broker and someone perhaps who could be persuaded of their point of view. In fact, I've since heard from the organizers of that event that I appeared at inviting me to come back.
That's great.
I'm thinking about it.
That's good to hear. Good evening.
Hello.
I love the phrase spiral of silence, but I wonder if to what extent can a spiral be self-sustaining? For example, if we say we're going to cancel all the communists, we don't want communists in public life. Some people will just say, I'm a communist and they'll be canceled. But as you suggest, a lot of people will resort to euphemism. They'll say, I'm not a communist, I'm a progressive, right? And then if you want to get the communists, you got to cancel people who say I'm a progressive, right? And then people have to shift further and further. Or, the Israel example, you end up with, you want to cancel the anti-Semites, can't say you like Hamas. So then people who are anti-Semites, they shift to something more moderate. As that happens, you draw in more and more people who are not communists, but they have, you're building up more internal opposition, I would say, right? So this is my question is, can it be a stable equilibrium, or is it a kind of phenomenon that eventually builds in its own backlash? I would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we're living through a kind of backlash on, I started out talking about the anti-racist being a kind of enforcers of of conformity to norms about how you talk about the race issue. And I think they overplayed their hands in retrospect. And I think the backlash that we're seeing playing out now, anathema that DEI has come to be seen as, and so on, is kind of a chickens coming home to roost phenomenon. And I think it, as I say, could be the forerunner of, stuff that's really kind of really racist. I mean, this is just my view, and I think it's contestable, it's arguable, but I think the Supreme Court decides in June of 2023 that the Students for Fair Admission, the Asian students, are on the right side of the 14th Amendment when they complain about racially preferential affirmative action policies which disadvantage them. And Justice Roberts writes of controlling opinion, and Justice Thomas writes of strong consent. Concurring opinion that lays down the law, and the new law going forward is a kind of colorblind doctrine that makes it very, very difficult to continue consistent with the current interpretation of the 14th Amendment to practice this kind of racially preferential admissions policies. Now, if you ask me, and we could go into it, that's okay. That's all for the good. That's, I think, the right 2025 move. Maybe not the right move in 1978 with that Baca case that was very famous. Maybe not the right move in 2002 or 2003 with Sandra Day O'Connor's, but in 2025, the right move. But what I see issuing from the new administration and whatnot in terms of anti-DEI zealotry is way, way more than simply colorblind practice in preferential admissions policy. It bespeaks or hints at a kind of antipathy to Black identity being given any recognition whatsoever. And I must say, I chafe at that. I must say I worry about that. And that's the backlash that I warn the guys who were running around talking about the Ta-Nehisi Coates of the world and the Nicole Hannah Joneses of the world, that's the 1619 Project, who were running around thinking that they had the upper hand because the mainstream media was backing their play, but that disgruntled Trump voter, that working class ethnic white, etc., wasn't buying it, and and we're seeing the consequences of that politically. And I don't know that it's going to be easily contained. So, yeah. I mean, I might add, since I think I'm probably in trouble here already. The thing that I was concerned about, calling everybody an anti-Semite, can be a difficult, dangerous road also. Not everybody's an anti-Semite who disagrees with, what's going on in Gaza. And you can both play that card too. And, it's not for me to say, but I'm sure that there are many prudent Jewish observers of what's going on who share that concern.
Well, welcome to Austin. And we're supposed to say to guests, don't move here. But in your case, we make an exception. It would be great if you lived here.
Let's talk compensation.
So I love your method of just going deep into these questions, like what's really going on, with the denial of people wanting to talk about certain subjects and the spiral of silence. And I've thought at times, maybe you agree or disagree, that what's going on when you have the advocates of structural explanations for poverty versus the advocates for, say, personal responsibility, at its deepest, it's metaphysical. It's whether you think people have free will or not. Is that accurate, do you think?
That's certainly a piece of it. I'm not a philosopher, but that question comes up all the time. And again, Kant, you got to assume, if you're going to have any theory of moral action, that people do have free will, even though it's obviously empirically, psychologically true that people are under the influence of all kinds of, forces that shape how they act. But yeah, I think there is a question of agency. The progressive and conservative angle of attack on these problems, I think, bespeaks differences in people's views about agency. I think progressives tend to think that the ability of people to act on behalf of their own interests effectively is not as great as the conservatives must be thinking that it is if they're going to be arguing for laissez-faire. But like I said, I'm not a philosopher. Do I have to be a philosopher if I hang out around here? I want somebody to ask me about utilitarianism and economics, though, because I think I might have touched on, I got economics colleagues in the audience. I might have touched on something. But anyway.
Hi. So I had a couple things. It was, to what extent does your truth culture have to be in terms of scale? Is it like a country level? Is it your university? Is it my D&D tabletop group? Like how truthy do I have to be?
Oh,
or is it just individual?
So, I use this device within a community of discourse. So I've kind of drawn a circle around the set of people who are talking to each other about something. And I think it does matter. Because the more idiosyncratic information I have, that is information specific to the person who's speaking, the less room there is for this inferential process that I've mentioned. Namely, they said this, therefore they must be that kind of person. Because I know, I'm intimately connected to my immediate family members. I'm not going to call them a fascist if they say something that's, a little bit right of center, and I'm not going to call them a racist if they say something that's a little bit off the beaten path on the racial questions. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But, families don't decide about going to war. Countries decide about going to war. And this idea that if I don't know the minds of my fellow citizens, I kind of don't really know my own mind, and that I get bad collective decisions when people are unwilling to take the risk of expressing themselves, I think is a more powerful idea at the more aggregative level of community. But that's just off the top of my head.
Okay. And then the follow up is that if your goal is getting a more truth seeking culture, is it something like everybody should be giving people the benefit of the doubt such that whatever someone says, even if it's heretical, is perceived as, oh, that's the truth as they see it to be? But you could argue another way of doing it would be deliberately make a culture where everybody says heretical thoughts so that you actually can't tell who the heretic is because everybody's saying heretical things.
I mean, what happened to argument? I mean, I want the benefit of disputation. I want to learn. I don't know it all a priori. So I want people with different thoughts engaging with each other. And I want them to, if you will, suspend disbelief a little bit. I mean, like a bracket on drawing too quick conclusions about the person in virtue of the fact that I haven't yet heard them out. Now, you know, if at the end of the day I think they're an idiot, an imbecile, or venal and bad, that's got to be a part of what's a permitted reaction to my exchange with them. But maybe a period in which I listen fully before I come to that conclusion is the best idea.
Thank you.
You think it's easy answering these questions? It ain't easy.
Hi, I'm so happy that you're here with us tonight.
Thank you.
I'm one of the members of the boards of trustees of University of Austin, and I have to credit you with getting behind this project, getting behind it with my time and my talents and our money. I've been a long time listener and supporter of yours, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up in this truth-seeking environment, letting you know that I am a little bit disappointed. I am disappointed in your views on Gaza and Israel. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity and a good learning experience for everyone, the students, the faculty, the other board members that are here tonight, to talk to you about this. Because I'm going to give my uneducated view on this, that the IDF doesn't have a choice, because Hamas is using the women and children as shields and using schools and hospitals to hide their combatants. So I felt like I needed to bring this to your attention, even though we're honored to have you here. And we'd love to have you come back and teach more and spend time with our students. But this is an area in which I disagree with you. Also not being an expert in Middle East politics and, the conflict. So I guess I'm looking for just a response or what would you have said to the synagogue had you been truthful with them in Palm Beach to a question such as that? How do you condemn what the IDF does, looking at the way that Hamas executes this war?
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you for your candor. You're not the only person to have made that speech to me. That is a person who disagrees and wants to know what I would have Israel do, what I would have the IDF do. I have responded on different occasions in different ways. Sometimes I've said, Israel's got to do what it's got to do. It's not my position to tell them what to do, but it is my position to tell me what I do and what to the extent that I'm a citizen of a country that's an independent actor, I'm prepared to endorse. I've also said, there's the logic of necessity and there's the logic of morality. You tell me that the enemy hides behind civilians. I have to go through the civilians to get to the enemy. I regret that. How many civilians do we go through? Does that matter at all? Is there any qualitative judgment about the blood that drips from my hands? Maybe not. It's easy for me to say that because I'm safely ensconced here and it's not on my head. But I'll answer indirectly because obviously it's a kind of thing that this is not about information. This is about emotion and spiritual commitment and meaning. I remember the scene in the film Oppenheimer at the end, where Robert Oppenheimer goes to the White House, to the Oval Office, and he meets with Harry Truman. Truman, driven by the logic of necessity, incinerated hundreds of thousands of people in the blink of an eye by ordering the dropping of those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He thought he had to do it. His answer to the question of morality was, what? I had to make the call. This is war. The alternatives were limited, and they are what they are, and I made the call. Oppenheimer is riven with doubt and guilt and the heavy weight of having been the architect of something that wrought so much death. Was he wrong to be riven with doubt? Was he wrong to feel guilt? Was he wrong to feel responsibility for so much death? Isn't so much death a horrific thing? So, as I said in my talk, what's going on in Gaza may be necessary from Israel's point of view, but it's not necessary for me to endorse it or to participate in it. That's a separate kind of question altogether. And that's kind of where I've come out. I'm trying to keep an open mind, and I appreciate your endorsement and support to the extent that you can give it.
Thank you, sir, for your time today. My question is, who, in your opinion, suffers more from self-censorship, the oppressed or the oppressor?
Well, I mean, can we get a little bit more information here? Oppressed and oppressor about what? I mean, because self-censorship is not only about oppression. I mean,
right. I'm just meaning it's a more conceptual question. I guess you can categorize oppressed and oppressor, but I think in history it changes. So I'm just meaning more broadly. In today's day and age, if you believe there's an oppressed and oppressor.
Well, okay, the oppressed. I mean, you've given me a binary. I'm going to choose the oppressed. I mean, what did I say? I said genuine moral argument becomes captive to the need to signal virtue and engage in platitudinous banalities. We don't get down to cases and we don't confront each other with the truth about our collective lives together, from which we can begin to make the hard calls that we have to make, because can't have everything. There are trade-offs and there's limited resources and there are alternatives among which one has to choose. But we need genuine moral resource. So, there's a lot of violence in some American cities. Much of it is perpetrated by young Black men. That's a real problem that has 100 different dimensions to it. But if we don't, if it's all racism, if it's all structural racism and the fault of the system, and we never get down to what's going on in the family and whatnot, we can't really engage that problem effectively. And the people who end up suffering from that are the people who can't afford to move away from the high crime areas of those cities and so forth. So, the oppressed are gonna suffer. On the other hand, I mean, I can hear somebody close to me, what about the billionaires? What about the inequality of the structural wealth? And not only with respect to violence in the cities, but with respect to the struggling working people who, don't know how they're going to pay their mortgages or educate their kids. And aren't they benefiting from self-censorship because we don't talk about the kind of radical revision of our economic and property relations that a genuine redistribution of wealth would require and all that? And then the self-censorship, to the extent that that's a correct argument, would be benefiting the powerful. So, I mean, you got a lot to choose from there.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
On a brighter note, who do you think is the greatest economist of all time? Other than yourself, of course.
Nah, man, don't be putting me, this is in the vernacular, don't be putting me up there with the Milton Friedmans and the Paul Samuelsons and the John Maynard Keyneses and the Alfred Marshalls and the David Ricardos and the Karl Marx. No, I didn't really say that. I'm just kidding. I'm at UATX. I'm messing with you guys. There are a lot of great economists to choose from. I'm not one of them, but I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Thank you.
No more questions, please.